Let me tell you about the day I sat across a dinner table from the man sleeping with my wife, smiled at him, refilled his glass, and laughed at his jokes. Let me tell you how I shook his hand at the end of the night, told him I'd have the quarterly numbers to him by Monday, and drove home in complete silence while my knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. Let me tell you what it feels like to know everything and be able to do absolutely nothing. His name was Dante Ricci. And if that name sounds like something out of a movie, trust me, the man himself was worse than anything Hollywood could have invented. I had been doing business with Dante for almost 4 years before I found out. 4 years of quarterly meetings, handshake deals, and six-figure contracts that kept my company breathing. Dante owned a string of logistics companies across the eastern seaboard. That was the official story. The real story was something I had always suspected but never let myself think about too hard. You don't ask questions when the check's clear. That's the first rule of survival in my industry. It was a rule I had followed without hesitation, right up until the evening I came home early from a conference in Chicago and found a silver cufflink on my bathroom floor. My wife's name is Elena. We had been married for 11 years. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, ironed her pillowcases, and cried at dog food commercials. She was the most ordinary, extraordinary person I had ever known, warm and careful and mine. Or so I had believed. The cufflink was small, monogrammed. A deep silver with a faint engraving on its face, the letter D, surrounded by a small laurel wreath. I had seen it before. I had seen it on the wrist of Dante Ricci at our last business dinner, 3 weeks prior. I remember because I had complimented it. He had smiled and said his mother gave it to him when he turned 30, that it was one of only 2 in the world. I stood in my bathroom for a very long time. Elena was downstairs cooking. I could smell garlic and olive oil drifting up through the floorboards, hear the low hum of whatever podcast she was always listening to about true crime, the irony of which I would not appreciate until much later. I slipped the cufflink into my pocket, washed my face, and walked downstairs. She turned when she heard me, and her face broke into a smile that looked completely, devastatingly normal. "You're back early," she said. "Conference ended faster than expected," I said. We ate dinner together that night. We talked about her sister's new baby and whether we should repaint the guest room. She laughed at something I said. I laughed too. I don't remember what the joke was. I don't think I was really there. The thing about discovering a betrayal is that it doesn't hit you all at once. It arrives in waves, each one bigger than the last. The first wave is disbelief, a kind of cold, clinical detachment that your brain uses to protect you. The cufflink is a coincidence. There is a perfectly reasonable explanation. You are being paranoid. The second wave is evidence. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a man I did not recognize. I checked her phone when she showered. I looked at credit card statements, cross-referencing dates against my own travel schedule. I hired a private investigator named Marcus, a squat, quiet man who wore the same gray jacket to every meeting and charged $800 a day. Marcus was thorough. Marcus was discreet. And 12 days after I handed him a photograph of Dante Ricci alongside a photograph of my wife, Marcus placed a manila envelope on the table between us at a coffee shop in Midtown and slid it toward me with 2 fingers. "You sure you want to open that?" he asked. I opened it. Inside were 14 photographs, 3 hotel receipts, and a printed record of 47 text messages recovered from a cloud backup that Marcus refused to explain how he accessed. The hotel receipts spanned 8 months. 8 months, which meant this had been happening while I was flying to Chicago, to London, to Singapore, building a business that Dante Ricci was my biggest client in. 8 months of quarterly meetings and handshakes and refilled glasses while my wife was spending her Tuesday afternoons in a suite at the Meridian Hotel on 54th Street. I paid Marcus in cash, left the envelope on the table, and walked out into the street. For a long time I just walked. I walked until my feet ached and the city blurred around me into streaks of light and noise. I walked past restaurants where couples sat together over candlelight. I walked past a man playing saxophone outside a subway entrance, his case open on the pavement, the sound of it following me for half a block before the city swallowed it. I walked until I ended up by the river, where I sat on a bench and stared at the dark water for an hour. And then the third wave hit, the one that doesn't crash. The one that rises slowly from somewhere deep beneath everything you thought you were, and just keeps rising. Rage. Here is what you need to understand about Dante Ricci. He wasn't just a client. He was the client. In my industry, private commercial logistics consulting, losing Dante's contract would be like losing oxygen. His annual retainer alone accounted for nearly 40% of my company's revenue. The other 60% was spread across a dozen smaller clients who, combined, barely matched what Dante paid in a single quarter. I had built my business around him, restructured my operations to accommodate his specific needs, hired staff he had personally approved. My entire financial architecture had Dante Ricci as its load-bearing wall. And Dante knew this. That, I came to understand later, was not an accident. I did not confront Elena. I did not call Dante. I did not do anything that any rational, self-respecting man would have done in my position. Instead, I went back to work on Monday morning, sent Dante his quarterly numbers as promised, and sat in my office for 3 hours staring at a wall. The fear arrived around Tuesday. It settled into my chest like something with weight, a cold, heavy thing that pressed against my ribs every time I thought about what I was sitting on. Because this was not a normal infidelity. This was not a situation where I could storm into a lawyer's office and file for divorce and walk away with my dignity intact. This was Dante Ricci, the man whose name caused a certain kind of silence in certain kinds of rooms. The man who, according to a federal indictment that had been quietly dropped 3 years prior, had connections to organized crime families in both New York and Naples. The man whose logistics companies ship things that no customs officer ever opened twice. If I confronted Elena, she would go to him. If I confronted Dante, I would disappear. If I went to the police, I had no evidence of anything illegal, only proof of an affair, and the kind of enemies that reduced life expectancy significantly. I was perfectly, completely trapped. And the cage had been built so neatly around me that I hadn't even noticed until the door was already shut. I started drinking more. Not visibly, I was careful about that. A glass of scotch at my desk before anyone arrived in the morning. Another after they left. I slept badly, dreamed worse. Elena noticed I was quieter than usual and asked if everything was okay at work. I told her it was. She put her hand on my shoulder and squeezed it, and I had to concentrate very hard on not flinching. The idea came to me at 3 in the morning, 6 weeks after I found the cufflink. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of scotch and a legal pad, writing down numbers. My company's numbers. What I owed, what I earned, what I would lose, what I would have left if the Ricci contract evaporated overnight. The answer, I already knew, was almost nothing. And then something strange happened. Looking at those numbers, really looking at them, the way you look at something when you've stopped being afraid of it, I felt the cage around me shift. Not open. Not disappear. But shift. Because I had been thinking about the contract as the thing protecting me, when in reality it was the thing controlling me. Dante needed my services because I was good at what I did. Because I had spent 4 years making myself indispensable to his operation. Because the 15-person team I had built around his account processed his contracts with a speed and discretion that no one else in the market could match. What if I destroyed that? Not all at once. Not in a way that looked deliberate. But slowly, carefully, systematically. What if I began to dismantle the very thing that made me valuable? What if I let the machine I had built start to fail? I wrote on the legal pad for 2 hours. By the time dawn began to gray the kitchen windows, I had something that looked less like a plan and more like a controlled demolition. Phase 1. Introduce inefficiencies. Subtle ones. Minor processing delays, small administrative errors, the kind of friction that accumulates imperceptibly over months until a client starts to wonder. Phase 2. Manage perception. Make the delays look like industry-wide issues, not internal failures. Phase 3. Begin quietly redistributing resources toward my smaller clients, building a foundation that didn't have Dante Ricci as its cornerstone. And Phase 4, the one I didn't write down, the one I only thought about in the space between words, was to be completely gone before Dante realized what I had done. Gone from the business. Gone from the city. Gone from Elena, if she chose Dante over reality. The plan terrified me. It was also the first thing that had made me feel anything other than helpless in 6 weeks. I started small. A delivery report filed 48 hours late. A contract amendment that required 3 rounds of revision instead of 1. I told my team these were new quality control protocols. They believed me. They always believed me. I had spent 4 years being the kind of boss who didn't make mistakes, so when the mistakes began to appear, they assumed they were their own. I hated that part. The collateral dishonesty of it. These were good people. Hard-working people who had built their professional lives around mine. Every time I watched one of them apologize to Dante's operations manager for a delay I had engineered, something in me twisted. But I kept going. Dante noticed within 6 weeks. He called me directly, not through his assistant, directly, and his voice on the phone had that particular quality I had heard him use once before, at a dinner where a junior associate had made an error in front of a client. Quite precise. Not angry in any register you could point to, but angry in the way that cold is angry. "Marcus," he said, he always called me Marcus, never Mark, "I want to understand what's happening with the Cartago filing." "I'm sorry, Dante," I said. "We've been dealing with some regulatory changes on the Eastern Corridor. Industry-wide issue. I've been in contact with 3 other firms who are experiencing the same delays. I'll send you a summary." There was a pause. "Do that," he said. I sent a summary. I had spent 4 hours writing it the night before, manufacturing citations, building a paper trail that looked completely legitimate. I was good at details. It was what had made me valuable to Dante in the first place, and now it was what I was using to work against him. He accepted the explanation. For the moment, what no plan accounts for is love. Or whatever it is that love becomes after 11 years and a betrayal, that complicated, ruinous feeling that doesn't have a clean name. I still loved Elena. That was the part one couldn't think about directly, the way you can't look directly at the sun. Even knowing what I knew, even with the photographs and the hotel receipts living in a locked drawer in my desk, I still reached for her in the dark sometimes and felt relief when she was there. I still noticed the way she laughed at things before they were funny, half a beat ahead of the punchline. I still made her coffee every morning, 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk, out of a habit so deep it had become instinct. There were moments when I thought about telling her I knew. Imagined the conversation 100 different ways. Sometimes in my imagination she cried and confessed, and we began the long, terrible work of rebuilding something. Sometimes she left. Sometimes she called Dante. That version of the conversation always ended the same way, and I always stopped the thought before it reached its conclusion. The fear of losing her was still there, wound around the rage like ivy on a building, so intertwined that I couldn't tell anymore which one was holding the other up. One night in February, she came home with flowers. Yellow ones, daffodils, my favorite. She put them in a vase on the kitchen table and stood back and looked at them the way she always did when she was pleased with something small. And I stood in the doorway watching her and thought, she has no idea that I am taking apart everything we built. She has no idea that I am planning to leave. She has no idea that I know about Dante, about the hotel, about the 8 months, about all of it. She is standing here with yellow flowers in a kitchen we painted together 3 years ago, and she has absolutely no idea. I didn't know whether that made her innocent or more guilty than I could bear. Dante called again in March. This time he asked to meet in person. We met at a restaurant he owned in the meatpacking district, a sleek, dark place where the staff moved like they had been trained not to exist. He was already seated when I arrived, and he stood to greet me with the kind of warmth that wealthy men perform so well. It's almost indistinguishable from the real thing. We shook hands. He ordered wine. He asked about Elena. "She's well," I said. "Good woman," he said, and held my gaze for 1 beat too long. It was the only moment in 4 years of knowing Dante Ricci that I came close to losing my composure. The heat that moved through me in that second was something I had never felt before, clean and absolute and very, very dangerous. I picked up my wine glass. I set it down. I kept my face exactly where it needed to be. "She is," I said. The rest of the dinner was business. He raised concerns about the cumulative delays, mentioned that his board was beginning to ask questions, suggested that perhaps it was time to revisit the terms of our agreement. I listened carefully, nodded at the right moments, offered measured reassurances that I had no intention of keeping. On my way home, I called my attorney. Not my business attorney, a different one. A woman named Sandra who specialized in something she called complex asset restructuring, which was a delicate way of describing the process of making things difficult to find. "Start moving," I told her. "How fast?" she asked. "Faster than comfortable," I said. April was when Elena changed. It was subtle at first. A certain distraction, a phone she now took upstairs when it buzzed late. Cancelled plans with friends she didn't explain. A distance in our conversations that had a specific texture, not the distance of a marriage settling into routine, but the charged, careful distance of someone managing two separate worlds. I watched all of it. I cataloged it with the same detached efficiency I had developed for everything over the past 5 months. I was becoming very good at detachment. I was also becoming very good at lying, at waiting, at sitting across from people who didn't know what I knew and speaking to them as though the ground beneath us was solid. In May, Sandra called to tell me the first phase of restructuring was complete. 3 of my smallest but most promising client accounts had been quietly migrated to a new entity that existed entirely independently of my main firm. It wasn't much, not yet. But it was a lifeboat. Dante's operations manager called the same week to formally raise the issue of contract performance in writing. This was expected. This was, in fact, what I had been building toward. A paper trail of legitimate-looking grievances. A documented deterioration. A business relationship that any reasonable party could look at and say, yes, this ended for cause, this ended naturally, this ended because of industry pressures and regulatory changes and a gradual decline in service that was no one's particular fault. I responded to the formal notice with a formal response. Measured, professional, apologetic without being incriminating. I was writing my own exit. The call came on a Thursday in June, 3 days before I had planned to submit a notice of voluntary contract termination. It was not from Dante. It was from Marcus, my private investigator, who had continued monitoring the situation at my request. His voice on the phone was the flattest I had ever heard it. "He knows that you know," Marcus said. I sat down. "How?" I asked. "Your wife." She told him. The room did something strange around the edges. I concentrated on a spot on the wall. "When?" I said. 2 nights ago. There was a conversation at the hotel. She was upset. Something about you being different lately, pulling away. She told him she thought you might have found out somehow. He's been quiet since then. That's not a good sign. It was not. I had maybe 48 hours before a man who did not accept losses quietly decided to determine exactly how much I knew and what I intended to do with it. The plan I had been executing over 5 careful months had suddenly compressed into 2 days. I called Sandra. I told her to accelerate everything. I called my attorney. I told him to prepare documentation. And then I sat in my office for 20 minutes and did nothing but think about Elena, about daffodils on a kitchen table, about morning coffee, about a woman who had broken me quietly for 8 months and then broken me completely by doing the one thing I had never fully let myself believe she would do. She had chosen him. Not in the way she had been choosing him on Tuesday afternoons at the Meridian Hotel, that had been its own kind of betrayal, one I had been working to survive. This was a different choice. This was standing at the edge of a burning building and pointing back at me. I left the office at 4 in the afternoon. I went home. Elena was in the kitchen, not cooking this time, just sitting at the table with a cup of tea, her phone face down beside it. She looked up when I came in and something moved across her face that I had never seen there before. Not guilt, exactly. Something closer to grief. "Mark," she said. "I know," I said. "Everything. For 5 months. I know about the hotel, I know about the texts, I know about how long it's been." She didn't cry. I had imagined her crying in every version of this conversation, but she didn't. She looked at me very steadily, the way you look at something you've been expecting for a long time. "Are you going to leave?" she asked. "I already have," I said. "I've been leaving for months. I just did it quietly." She asked about the business. I told her the truth, that I had been systematically dismantling my relationship with Dante, that within 30 days the contract would be formally terminated, that I had built something new and small and entirely separate from him, and that by the time Dante Ricci decided to make a move, I would be legally, financially, and geographically unreachable. She stared at me. "You did all of that," she said, while sitting across from him at dinners and not saying anything. "Yes," I said. "And you didn't confront me because you were scared I'd leave." The honesty of it landed between us like something dropped from a height. "Yes," I said again. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I ended it 2 weeks ago. I ended it because..." And then she stopped and looked at the table, and I watched her try to find words for something that probably didn't have any. "It doesn't matter," I said. Not cruelly. Just with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. "I want to tell you that there was a clean ending. That Elena and I either reconciled beautifully or separated cleanly, that Dante's reaction was measurable and manageable, that my small lifeboat of a company grew into something sturdy and good. I want to tell you that knowing everything turned out to be power. But life doesn't work in clean endings. What I can tell you is this: Dante never came after me directly. Whether it was because the contract termination had been so carefully documented that any retaliation would have looked like confirmation of things he couldn't afford to confirm, or whether it was because a man like Dante preferred to cut his losses and move on to easier targets, I don't know. Marcus told me later that Dante had asked questions, made calls, looked into the new entity Sandra had built. But he found nothing that was worth the exposure, and eventually, like water, he found another path. The new company was small. It is still small. It pays its bills and its people, and it doesn't have any load-bearing walls. Elena and I did not divorce immediately. We did something stranger and harder. We stayed, for a while, in the same house with all of it in the open between us, and we had the conversations that should have happened much earlier in 11 years of marriage, and some of those conversations were the most honest things I have ever said to another person. Whether that honesty was enough, whether it added up to something survivable, that is a story for another time. What I know is this: I came home one evening in October and there were yellow flowers on the kitchen table again. Daffodils. And I stood in the doorway looking at them for a long time. And I made 2 cups of coffee, 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk. And I sat down.